If you spent any time watching or reading political news lately, especially around big elections, well, you've definitely felt it.
Oh, yeah, that intensity.
Exactly. The sheer emotional weight of the language they use. It's not, dry policy talk.
Not at all.
It's rhetoric, just packed, absolutely packed with judgment. People sometimes call these thick words or emotive terms.
Yeah.
Things like, losers, stupid, rigged, or even stuff like scum.
They hit hard and fast.
Right. They don't give you time to sit back and think through some complex argument. It's like they go straight for the gut, provoking this immediate strong reaction. But how does that work? How does a single word manage to just bypass your normal critical thinking and hook right into your emotions, your commitments?
That's the core question, really.
So, okay, let's unpack this. This deep dive is all about getting under the hood, looking at the hidden logic, the philosophical structure behind those really charged words. Our mission here is to give you, the listener, a kind of forensic toolkit, a logical way to assess this language.
Yeah, moving beyond just saying, oh, that's biased.
Exactly. We want to actually map the argumentative structure of emotion itself, treating it less like a vague feeling.
And more like a process, a set of inferences you can actually trace.
Okay, so where do we start with that?
Well, that structure is absolutely key. Often, in political analysis, we talk about manipulative language in a very general way. But the sources we're looking at, they push us towards something more specific, treating emotive meaning not as this fuzzy, subjective thing,
Right.
but as a definable structure, a pattern of inferences that you can actually map out and evaluate, like a tiny argument packed inside a single word.
Wow, okay. A micro-argument.
Pretty much. And to do that, we first need to nail down what an emotive word actually does. What's its function?
Okay.
And fundamentally, these words work in a kind of duality. They aren't purely descriptive. They don't just give you neutral information about something, modify your cognitive state.
They do more than just inform?
They do. They serve a second really crucial purpose. They fundamentally shape the listener's attitudes towards whatever's being discussed. And, importantly, they implicitly nudge you, suggest or endorse a specific course of action.
Okay, so give me an example. If I say the new policy affects citizens, that sounds pretty neutral descriptive.
It is pure information, mostly.
But if I say the new policy cripples citizens, whoa, that feels totally different.
Exactly. You're not just informing anymore. You're aiming to make your listener feel something strong enough to potentially make them act, maybe protest against it, vote against it, that sort of thing.
Got it. So it's descriptive and directive in a way.
Precisely. And that lands us right in the middle of a tricky philosophical problem. What is the exact definable link between the word someone chooses, the sentence they put them in, and what they're actually intending psychologically? When a speaker picks a charged word, they're essentially trying to take a shortcut. They're bypassing the usual, sometimes complex chain of reasoning that takes us from understanding the literal meaning of something to deciding what to do about it.
They're injecting a pre-made attitude.
Yes, a pre-packaged psychological stance that they hope is, well, stable and catchy, infectious even.
Okay, so to really trace this duality, this split between describing and directing, you're saying we need to go back a bit.
We do. Some of the groundwork for this was actually laid way back in the 17th century by Antoine Arnauld and Pierre Nicole in their big work, Logic, or the Art of Thinking. They talked about something they called incidental ideas.
Incidental ideas.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Well, Arnauld and Nicole noticed that words, and language generally, often carry much more meaning than we consciously register, more than just the strict dictionary definition.
Oh.
When you hear something, it creates the main idea, the principal idea, that's the core cognitive content. But alongside that, it triggers a whole bunch of these incidental ideas.
Like side effects.
Sort of, yeah. Attitudes, feelings, associations. And the key thing is, the listener often absorbs these incidental ideas without really noticing, without being fully aware of the complete impression being formed in their mind.
That sounds subtle. Do they have an example?
They do, and it's a classic one, really helps clarify it. Imagine someone just says to you, you lied about it.
Okay, pretty direct.
The principal meaning, the purely descriptive part, is quite cold and factual. It just means you stated something while knowing the opposite is true. That's the bit you could, in theory, verify, the propositional content.
Right, just the facts of the matter.
But We all know that in real life, saying you lied about it carries way more weight than that. It carries a powerful incidental idea.
Which is?
The feeling of contempt and outrage. It signals that the speaker isn't just stating a fact, they're judging you. And they maybe don't even care if they damage your reputation by saying it.
Okay. So the main idea hits your brain. The incidental idea hits your feelings and social standing.
Exactly. The principal idea triggers the cognitive bit. The incidental idea triggers the emotion and the shift in attitude.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does this connect to the more modern idea of emotive meaning?
Well, this philosophical split separating the cognitive content from the attitudinal impact was really formalized much later in the 20th century by an ethicist named Charles Stevenson. He coined the term emotive meaning.
Right.
And for Stevenson, a really central concept was the idea of a word's potentiality.
Potentiality. Like its potential to do something.
Precisely. Stevenson saw emotive meaning as the stable tendency or potential of a word to spark specific emotional reactions in people. And those reactions, in turn, influence the listener's interest, pushing them towards making a decision.
So the word itself has an inherent power, a potential to move people.
Yes, an inherent capacity to be action-oriented. And Stevenson made a crucial point. These terms don't just describe the interests people already have, they actively try to change or intensify those interests.
So it's not passive.
Not at all. The word effectively recommends that you adopt a certain interest or attitude towards something, rather than just observing that you already feel that way.
It's trying to recruit you emotionally.
That's a good way to put it. It's an active influence.
Okay, but what if the listener already feels really strongly against whatever the word refers to? You know, if I already hate something and someone uses a negative word for it, does the potentiality still matter? Is the word trying to override my existing feelings?
That's a really sharp question. It gets right to the heart of how stable this potentiality actually is. For the emotive word to work as the speaker intends, they're relying on that potentiality being pretty widely shared, a common reaction.
Yeah.
So in your example, if you already despise, say, the concept of political correctness, and a speaker uses that term negatively, it just confirms what you already feel. It reinforces your existing attitude. But if the speaker is trying to persuade someone who's maybe neutral or even slightly positive about it, that's where the potentiality comes in. Through repetition, through associating the term with negative things, the speaker tries to forge a new negative interest. They try to create this wedding, as Stevenson called it, between the descriptive idea and the desired negative attitude.
This wedding. Tell me more about that. That sounds key.
It is absolutely key. These emotive words, often called ethical words too, are powerful because they manage to fuse two things together. The descriptive, meaning the facts of the situation, and the emotive, meaning the push towards a certain attitude or interest.
Information and emotional guidance, all in one package.
Exactly. It's incredibly efficient. And this is where the manipulation can happen. Because if a speaker can subtly redefine the descriptive half of that wedding, they can shift your attitude without you even realizing the definition changed underneath you. The emotional connection stays, but it gets attached to something new. Sneaky. Okay, and before we move off this foundational stuff, you mentioned we need to be careful about distinguishing the word's potentiality, its emotive meaning, from the cause of that potentiality. Why is that separation important?
It's really vital for maintaining some objectivity in the analysis. The cause of why a word makes us feel a certain way is often tied up in our shared cultural values, the ethical dimension.
Like tyranny feels bad because we value freedom.
Exactly. That value is the cause. But the potentiality of the word tyranny, its tendency to evoke that negative feeling, is a property of the language itself, something we can try to map linguistically.
Okay.
Think about, say, the words dog versus cur. They could potentially refer to the exact same animal, right? Same descriptive meaning in that sense.
Yeah.
But cur carries this strong negative potentiality, this built-in feeling of contempt or disgust because of how it's historically been used, even if our general cultural value attached to dogs is positive.
Got it. So the potentiality is about the word's baggage. It's history of use, not just the thing it points to. Precisely. And our goal here in this analysis is to map that potentiality, the word's structural capability to trigger emotions, rather than getting lost in the specific, subjective reasons why any one individual reacts. Focusing on the potentiality lets us treat emotive meaning as something we can actually analyze structurally.
Okay, this is where it starts to get really practical, I think. We've got this idea of emotive meaning as a kind of stable potential embedded in words. Now, how do political actors actually use this? What are the specific tricks, the linguistic tools they pull out to shape those incidental ideas and, well, manufacture emotions?
Yeah, the sources break this down really nicely. They categorize the strategies, starting with the most blunt instruments, you could say,
Yeah.
direct slurs and really loaded adjectives.
Okay, let's take case one from the research. Using the word scum to describe opponents or maybe journalists, that's about as direct as it gets.
It really is. Words like scum are what linguists call lexicalized metaphors, and they function as slurs. Their actual dictionary definition includes a negative evaluation. Scum means something like a very bad or immoral person.
So the judgment is right there in the definition. No ambiguity.
None at all. The evaluation is part of the descriptive meaning. Then you have straightforwardly evaluative adjectives, words like horrible, terrible, disgusting.
Right.
These words explicitly state an assessment, and they're clearly designed to encourage the listener to feel a parallel emotion, fear from horrible, general unpleasantness from terrible, or disgust from disgusting.
It's like they're telling you how to feel.
Pretty much, yeah. And then there's a slightly different category, words like illegitimate or lying. These get used all the time for judgment, but maybe their core definition isn't quite as inherently charged as a slur.
How so?
Well, these are often called ethical words. Lying or illegitimate point to a state of affairs, an action or status that our culture generally evaluates negatively. So they definitely have the potentiality to trigger secondary emotions like contempt for lying. But the negative evaluation isn't strictly part of the word's primary definition in the same way it is for scum. It's more of a strong cultural association with the thing being described.
Ah, I see. So because the negativity is slightly less baked into the core definition, maybe these words are a bit easier to redefine later.
Exactly. They are slightly more flexible, which, as we'll see, becomes very important for certain rhetorical strategies.
Okay. So moving beyond direct insults and adjectives, metaphors.
Yeah.
You mentioned these are super efficient ways to just download an entire emotional landscape with one word.
They really are. Metaphors work by activating a whole semantic frame or maybe a cultural script associated with the image they use, what rhetoricians call the vehicle.
Okay.
They bring along all the common ground, all the usual associations and feelings linked to that image. The previous ways that image has been used make certain properties, often highly evaluative ones, suddenly seem very relevant, very accessible in the listener's mind. The speaker is basically tapping into a shared cultural shortcut.
So case 2 in the source material used the word behemoth to describe trade partners like South Korea or Germany, right? During arguments about trade deficits.
Yes. Now think about the vehicle there, behemoth. What does that bring to mind?
Something huge, monstrous, maybe unstoppable, like from the Bible.
Exactly. It's this image of a biblical mighty beast, a monster associated with chaos, overwhelming power, maybe even destruction.
Right.
So by slapping that label onto an economic partner, the speaker completely sidesteps any nuanced discussion of trade policy, tariffs, exchange rates, all that complex stuff.
And just makes them sound scary.
Precisely. The listener is led directly to a negative judgment. The activated frame isn't economics, it's existential threat, it's chaos. And the immediate emotional response triggered by that frame is danger. And danger leads directly to fear.
Wow. So turning a trade negotiation into a scary monster movie just with one word.
That's the power of metaphorical framing.
Okay, then case 3, describing the U.S. as a dumping ground for migrants. You said that one seems designed to hit two emotional buttons at once, contempt and anger. How does that work?
It's a really potent combination. The vehicle, dumping ground, immediately activates a frame related to garbage, waste, littering, pollution, unwanted things being discarded.
Okay, unpleasant.
Very. First, this implicitly labels the people arriving, the migrants, as equivalent to garbage. This triggers an evaluation based on perceived inferiority, which is the psychological root of contempt.
Seeing them as worthless, basically.
Yes, but the rhetorical move goes further. By framing the nation as the place being dumped upon, like someone's property being littered on, it casts the situation as an undeserved offense, a violation against the property and, the territorial integrity of the existing population, the Americans in this case.
So it's not just that the garbage is inferior, it's that someone is wrongfully putting it here.
Exactly. And that transition from feeling contempt based on inferiority to feeling anger based on experiencing an undeserved offense against what's rightfully yours, that's a classic trigger for political action, for mobilization.
That's fascinating, how one term can push you down two distinct but mutually reinforcing emotional paths. Contempt dismisses, anger motivates.
A very powerful rhetorical tactic.
Okay, so metaphors use shared context.
Yeah.
But similes, like in case 4, seem to work differently, more through contrast.
That's right. Case 4 was describing a political rival, Marco Rubio, as weak like a baby. Now, the word baby on its own doesn't always have negative feelings attached. Often it's positive or neutral innocence, smallness, vulnerability.
Yeah, usually.
But the simile here specifically picks out one associated concept, helplessness, to hammer home the intended evaluation, weakness.
Okay.
The real rhetorical punch, though, comes from the contrast. You're explicitly comparing the image of a helpless infant with the expected image of a presidential candidate, someone who's supposed to project strength, competence, power.
Right, the roles are completely opposite.
Exactly. And that clash, that cognitive dissonance, is designed to provoke not fear or anger, but contempt and ridicule. The goal is dismissal, to make the target seem absurd, unworthy of serious consideration. Okay, so we've seen how emotions get attached through direct labels, metaphors, similes. Once we get how that works, we can move on to the really subtle stuff. The strategies that political operators use to actually change or redirect those established emotive meanings.
Right, this feels like the next level of manipulation.
It often is. This is where they try to subtly shift your ideological landscape, your values, your commitments, often without ever laying out a clear, explicit argument for why you should change your mind.
And this brings us back to Stevenson, right? He had specific mechanisms for this.
He did, two main ones: persuasive definitions and quasi-definitions. Let's start with persuasive definitions. These ones target the descriptive part of that wedding we talked about earlier.
Okay, the factual side of the emotive word.
Exactly. A persuasive definition involves a speaker redefining an ethical word, sometimes explicitly, but usually implicitly. The goal is to take the word's existing, stable, emotional charge.
Like it's positive or negative feeling.
Right. And attach it, redirect it onto a different state of affairs, something the word wouldn't normally apply to. As Stevenson put it, the effect is basically changing the hearer's interests by changing names.
You keep the emotion, but swap the target.
That's the core idea. But the whole strategy hinges on ambiguity, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, the speaker starts using the word with their new, private, redefined meaning. But the listener, who hasn't been clued in, just hears the word and processes it using the old, familiar, commonly understood meaning.
Ah, so there's a mismatch. The speaker means X, the listener hears Y, but the feeling attached to Y gets transferred to X without the listener noticing the switch.
Precisely. It's a deliberate exploitation of ambiguity. This allows the speaker to transfer a strong, pre-existing positive or negative feeling from the word's usual target onto their new intended target. Case 5, using the word genius in relation to the public's view of the media, is a perfect example.
Right, the quote was something like, the level of genius in the public, they get it, they fully understand.
Okay, think about the word genius. What does it normally mean?
Exceptional talent, super high intelligence, something very rare and amazing. Like Einstein.
Exactly. Very great and rare natural ability. It carried this undeniable feeling of admiration, respect, maybe even awe, a very strong positive evaluation. Now, in that quote, the speaker applies this word genius to what? To the ordinary capacity of people to be skeptical of the media, to get it, to understand alleged dishonesty.
Something pretty common, arguably. Not exactly Einstein-level rarity.
Right. So by applying the genius label with all its positive emotional baggage to this common average ability, the speaker pulls off a neat trick. They transfer the admiration and respect normally reserved for the truly exceptional onto the average person's skepticism.
So it makes ordinary skepticism sound brilliant.
Yes. And subtly, this starts to reshape the public's shared understanding. It conditions people to see a common capacity or even common workers as somehow exceptional. It elevates a routine thought process to something worthy of admiration, which in turn reinforces the speaker's underlying narrative about who is smart and who isn't in this case, pitting the genius public against the presumably non-genius media.
Wow, okay. That's subtle but powerful. Now, quasi-definitions, you said that these attack the emotive meaning directly, not the description.
That's the difference. A quasi-definition aims to change the word's disposition, its potentiality to trigger a specific emotional response. But it usually doesn't do it with a single, neat redefinition.
How does it work then?
It's typically done through sheer repetition. consistently using the word or phrase in a very specific, new, and usually highly charged emotional context. Over time, this repetition builds up new, stable, negative, or sometimes positive incidental ideas associated with the term.
Like conditioning, almost.
Very much like conditioning. And case 6, the way the term politically correct, or PC, has been used is probably the textbook modern example of this. A phrase that started out relatively neutral, maybe even mildly positive for some.
Yeah, meaning like being considerate, not offensive.
Right. But it was deliberately and systematically quasi-defined over time to carry intensely negative connotations.
How was that done in the rhetoric analyzed?
It was done by relentlessly associating the phrase politically correct with negative concepts, incidental ideas like hypocrisy, foolishness, being afraid to speak truth, wasting time, cowardice.
So just constantly linking PC to bad stuff.
Exactly. And crucially, the strategy often involves setting up an explicit contrast. Being politically correct was framed as the opposite of dealing with big trouble, the opposite of focusing on serious national interests.
So PC equals trivial, unserious, maybe even dangerous because it distracts from real problems.
Precisely. By repeatedly hammering that contrast, the speaker effectively quasi-defines being politically correct as being fundamentally unserious, a distraction, a waste of valuable time when real issues are at stake. This attaches a stable, powerful, negative emotive, meaning dismissiveness, contempt to the phrase itself, completely flipping its rhetorical function.
Okay, this is leading us to sort of the analytical core, right? We've seen the tools, the strategies. We've established that this charged language isn't just random noise. It's structured. It's designed. And the really fascinating argument here is that the journey from just hearing a loaded word to actually feeling an emotion or making a decision, it isn't just a jump. It's actually a chain of like super compressed logical steps, micro arguments that we normally just skip over.
That's the key insight. We usually experience it as instantaneous, but the claim is there's an underlying rational structure, even if it operates incredibly quickly.
And the breakthrough then is that we can actually make that vague idea of emotive meaning more concrete, more objective by mapping out these hidden inferential steps using formal tools like argumentation schemes.
Precisely. When we use or hear an emotive word, it's implicitly triggering typically two main kinds of inference.
Okay.
The first type is based on the descriptive meaning. This is the inference that attributes some property or quality to the thing being talked about. It's essentially the microprocess of naming or classifying something.
Step 1. Put a label on it.
Pretty much. The second type of inference stems from the emotive meaning. This involves a sequence. Moving from that initial description or classification to making a value judgment, deciding if it's good or bad, and then potentially moving towards a commitment to act, towards making a decision.
Description, judgment, and action, almost like a mini rational process.
In structure, yes.
Yeah.
Even if it happens heuristically, very fast.
Okay, let's break down these schemes. Start with the foundation. Argumentation scheme 1, AS1, the argument from classification. This sounds like the basis for the naming part.
It is. AS1 captures the fundamental logic of how we attribute properties based on categories. The basic structure is, if something A belongs to a category C, then A has a certain property P, just by virtue of being in category C. Premise 2, A is in category C, conclusion. Therefore, A has property P.
Seems straightforward enough. A is a bird, birds have feathers, therefore A has feathers.
Exactly. But for analyzing rhetoric, the crucial part isn't the structure itself, but interrogating that second premise. A is C. How did the speaker decide to put A in category C? We use a specific tool here, a critical question, often labeled CQ2. Is that classification premise, A is C, based on a solid definition? Is it just a general description, or is it maybe based on a loaded stereotype?
Why does that distinction, that the definition versus description versus stereotype, matter so much?
Because it determines the argument's defeasibility. That's just a technical term for how easy it is for someone listening to challenge or reject the speaker's conclusion.
Okay, so if the classification is solid, the conclusion is hard to argue with. If it's shaky.
The conclusion is much weaker, much easier to defeat. Let's use the example from the study. Classifying a political opponent, say Hillary Clinton, as politically correct.
Right.
Now, if the speaker is implicitly classifying her based on a strict, generally acceptable definition of PC, like a person is PC if they try to avoid language that might cause offense.
Okay, seems reasonable as a definition.
Then the conclusion that follows, therefore she tries to avoid causing offense, is pretty hard to challenge unless you can show she doesn't actually do that. The argument itself is structurally quite strong based on that definition.
Got it.
But This is where the rhetorical game happens. What if the speaker isn't using that neutral definition? What if they're using the quasi-definition we talked about, the one loaded with negative associations?
One that equates PC with being cowardly or dishonest.
Exactly. So the implicit premise becomes, PC people are those who are cowards, don't speak their mind, and ignore real problems. Now, when the speaker says Clinton is politically correct, based on this premise.
The conclusion changes completely.
Right. The conclusion becomes, therefore, she is a coward and doesn't speak her mind. But now, that conclusion rests entirely on a highly debatable negative stereotype embedded in the quasi-definition. It's incredibly defeasible.
So the speaker uses the seemingly simple label PC to sneak in a whole controversial argument based on a stereotype, hoping we won't notice the switch from definition to stereotype.
That's the maneuver in a nutshell. Relying on the emotive shortcut of the label PC to make a weak, easily challenged premise seems strong.
Okay, that makes sense. So once that classification, however shaky, is implicitly accepted, what's the next logical step? Argumentation scheme 2, the argument from values.
Yes. AS2 is the bridge. This is where the cultural stakes get injected into the argument. It connects the classification or description, X, to a specific value judgment, V.
Yeah.
The scheme basically says X is considered positive or negative according to value V. This evaluation affects how we see a particular goal. Therefore, the positive or negative value of X gives us a reason to either keep or abandon our commitment to that goal G. Goal G here could be something very general, like overall approval or disapproval.
So this is where good or bad comes in, based on cultural norms.
Absolutely. These evaluative premises saying something is good or bad according to value V are deeply embedded in culture. The speaker has to pick a charged word whose associated value V resonates with the audience's existing cultural beliefs.
So, with PC again, is it good because the underlying value V is minimizing offense and social harm? Or is it bad because the underlying value V is truth-telling, even if it's blunt, and PC promotes hypocrisy?
Exactly. The speaker's choice of the charged term implicitly steers the listener towards adopting one side of that value equation, presenting it as the obviously correct one.
Got it. And the final piece is connecting that value judgment to actually doing something.
Right.
Argumentation scheme 3, argument from consequences.
Right. AS3 closes the loop, bringing it back to practical action. The basic structure is, if we do action Q, certain consequences, good or bad, are likely to happen. We find those consequences desirable or undesirable. Therefore, we should or should not do action Q.
Simple cause and effect, leading to a decision.
Pretty much. This is the underlying logic that takes you, for instance, from the negative evaluation of a candidate labeled politically correct, based on the judgment in AS2, to the concrete action. Therefore, I should not vote for her, or I should support her opponent instead.
And the emotion stirred up by the charged word, the contempt, the fear, the anger, is what helps you glide across that logical bridge quickly without stopping to check the premises too carefully.
That's exactly it. The emotion acts like a lubricant, facilitating that quick, often uncritical transition through the classification, valuation, action sequence. Okay, so that three-step logical process, AS1, AS2, AS3, that represents the, let's call it the slow route, the path of careful deliberation, critical thinking, checking the steps.
The way we'd analyze it on paper.
Right. But the real rhetorical punch, the reason emotive words are so effective in politics is because they exploit the fast route. They tap into heuristic reasoning, mental shortcuts that completely bypass that slow critical assessment.
And this connects to how psychologists think about emotions, right? That emotions themselves can function as these kinds of shortcuts.
Absolutely. Modern cognitive theories of emotions suggest that emotions aren't just random feelings. They usually presuppose some kind of underlying judgment or evaluation that we've made, often unconsciously. It's called appraisal.
So I feel angry because I've quickly appraised a situation as unfair.
Exactly. You feel an emotion because you've implicitly judged whether something helps or hinders your goals, matches or violates your expectations. And the emotional response triggered by a loaded word acts as exactly this kind of heuristic mechanism, a cognitive shortcut.
So instead of carefully working through, is this person PC, AS1? Is PC bad, AS2? Should I therefore oppose them, AS3?
Right.
The word PC, if it's been quasi-defined negatively, just triggers an immediate feeling of, say, contempt or annoyance, which instantly delivers the conclusion, this person is bad, should be opposed.
Precisely. These emotional shortcuts lead to rapid, often biased, automatic judgments of right or wrong, good or bad. They operate with very low mental effort. And crucially, they actively inhibit the motivation to engage in that slower, more systematic, critical assessment of all the premises and variables involved in the formal schemes. AS1, AS3.
So hearing liar doesn't prompt me to check the evidence for the lie, AS1, or carefully weigh the moral gravity, AS2. It just instantly flags the person as contemptible, untrustworthy. The negative feeling provides the decision shortcut.
That's the heuristic power. Hearing dumping ground doesn't just describe migrants arriving, it instantly equates them with garbage through the metaphor, triggering the shame and anger tied to pollution and violation, delivering a prepackaged negative judgment.
But for this to work reliably, the speaker needs that emotional potential of a word to be pretty stable, right? How does that stability get built into language?
Great question. It ties into linguistic concepts like connotation and what some call core sense. Connotation refers to all those extra bits of meaning that cling to a word beyond its strict dictionary definition, the associated feelings, the ideological slant, the value judgments.
Those incidental ideas again.
Exactly. They are the stuff of connotation. And what happens over time is that the way a word is typically used in specific contexts, its speech meaning becomes culturally associated with the word itself. This repeated usage builds up a stable connotative meaning.
So the words start to soak up the feelings from the situations it's used in.
That's a good way to think about it. Lexical items, words, effectively encapsulate the history of their use within a speech community. They develop a kind of core sense, the most frequent, most regular, most familiar, emotional, and evaluative associations that members of that community share.
Ah, okay. So when a speaker uses a word like socialist or patriot, they're banking on triggering that shared history, that core sense, regardless of the specific details of the current situation.
Precisely. They rely on that shared cultural history of emotional response being automatically activated.
And this shared history, these automatic connections, allow speakers to play on our implicit assumptions, our basic cultural rules of thumb, things called topoi.
Exactly. Topo are absolutely central to how this fast heuristic reasoning works. Think of them as underlying argumentative connections, like implicit instructions or cultural if-then statements that we all mostly agree on without stating them.
Like, if someone helps others, they're good.
Or, if something is unnatural, it is bad. Or, relevant here, if someone is a liar, then they are untrustworthy. Emotive words are powerful because they automatically activate these relevant heuristic topoi.
So scum might activate the topos. If someone is scum, socially toxic, then they deserve contempt and harsh treatment.
Perfect example. The speaker doesn't need to argue for that rule. They just use the word scum and rely on the listener automatically applying the associated topos without critical reflection.
Okay, so this is how they manage to change our commitments without actually giving us reasons. By manipulating these underlying assumptions, these topoi, through presupposition.
Yes. The redefinition strategies we discussed earlier, persuasive and quasi-definitions, are essentially sophisticated ways of manipulating presuppositions to install or reinforce these topoi.
How do they work differently in terms of presupposition?
They target different kinds. First, persuasive definitions, like the genius example, case 5, work by triggering what are called sortal presuppositions.
Sortal, meaning related to categories or types.
Exactly. A sortal presupposition takes the truth of a classification for granted. When the speaker calls the public's understanding genius, they are speaking as if this classification is simply true. They presuppose it. By doing so, they subtly pressure the listener to implicitly accept the premise that this common capacity belongs in the exceptional category of genius. The listener accommodates the presupposition, accepting the altered category without a fight.
Okay, so persuasive definitions smuggle in a new classification. What about quasi-definitions, like with politically correct, case 6?
Quasi-definitions typically work by triggering conditional presuppositions. These presuppose the truth of an entire if-then statement, a topos.
Ah, okay.
Remember the argument, we don't have time for political correctness because the country faces big trouble. Making that specific argument implicitly presupposes the truth of the underlying conditional rule, the topos. If someone is politically correct, then they are wasting time and not addressing real problems. The speaker treats this highly debatable if-then rule as if it's just common sense, a shared truth.
So they presuppose the connection between being PC and being ineffective.
Precisely. They take the topos for granted, subtly modifying the listener's commitments by smuggling that conditional rule into the shared ground of the conversation, presenting it as undeniable. Understanding this lets you see exactly which unproven rule the speaker is trying to sneak past your critical defenses. #tag outro.
Okay, wow. So this deep dive really took us from just feeling the heat of political language to actually mapping its internal wiring. We've gone from vague ideas about loaded words to a much more rigorous structural way of seeing them.
Yeah, seeing the mechanics behind it.
We've seen how charged language isn't just noise, it's a deliberate rhetorical structure, whether it's through direct name-calling, clever metaphors, or these really subtle redefinitions of terms. It seems engineered to shift your commitments, your attitudes, often by playing on and short-circuiting that predictable chain of reasoning, classifying something, evaluating it, and deciding what to do.
And having the tools to actually map those inferences, AS1, AS2, AS3, is incredibly useful. It gives you a way to critically evaluate what's happening.
Right. Instead of just feeling pushed, you can pinpoint the exact step where the manipulation might be happening. Is it the classification itself that's dodgy? Is it the value judgment they're trying to impose? Or is it the leap from judgment to a specific action?
Exactly. It allows for a much more specific critique. Of course, how any individual actually reacts emotionally still depends on a million personal factors beyond just the word itself. But this framework lets us analyze the argument the word is designed to make, the potential trigger.
It objectifies the potential argument, even if the final feeling is subjective.
Well put.
So thinking about the bigger picture, the political power, the stability of any given emotive word really seems to depend on how often and how successfully that underlying rule, that topos it relies on, gets used and just accepted without question in the culture.
That's a great point. The more a topos like if X then Y gets activated by a word and accepted implicitly, the stronger that word's emotive meaning becomes.
So the next time you hear a really charged word thrown around, especially if it's being used in a slightly new or aggressive way, you're not just hearing an insult or a label. You're potentially witnessing a live attempt to rewrite a piece of the shared cultural logic that shapes our instant automatic emotional responses.
It's an attempt to modify the implicit rules of the game.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe take away and chew on. When you encounter that kind of loaded language, try not to just react to the surface emotion it triggers.
Instead, try to step back and ask, what's the hidden rule here? What's the implicit condition, the topos, that this speaker is trying to sneak into my set of shared beliefs?
What unproven premise is this word trying to make me accept as just obvious shared cultural truth?